Welcome back to the Lost Legends. I'm Adam Jones, and happy Valentine's Day. Now, you may have heard some news lately about Captain Cook, specifically that some divers may have discovered his old ship. It's quite a find, and it's one that's led many people to realize that they can't remember who Captain Cook is. Well, don't worry, folks. As always, I'm here to help. And trust me, no matter how bad your Valentine's Day is, Captain Cook's last Valentine's Day was much, much worse. Captain James Cook is one of those people from history that everyone's heard of, but it's hard to remember exactly why they're so important. In this case, it's hard to talk about Cook because his accomplishments are marred by his terrible behavior, and because he was more important to the British Empire than to the world at large. So his importance has been downplayed now that the British Empire doesn't loom over our lives. For years, the British would tell you that Captain Cook discovered Australia and New Zealand and lots of places, including Hawaii, which is where things got bad for him. Of course, today we realize how inappropriate that sounds. None of these places needed to be discovered since they had already been discovered by the indigenous people who live there. But we can credit Captain Cook with helping Europeans to fill in the missing places on their maps and showing us just how big and interesting the world really is. But his legacy just isn't simple. Captain James Cook sailed during the 1700s, and he spread British colonialism wherever he went. And while his exploits at sea are certainly impressive, the closer we look at this guy, the worse he gets. Captain Cook was a scumbag, to put it lightly. And I believe he had what we call a god complex, which I think played a role in his death. Now, like I said, if you've heard his name come up in the news lately, that's because some divers think they found one of his ships. This ship was called the Sandwich, named after Cook's patron, Lord Sandwich. It was used as a warship after Cook's death, and it must have been the least scary ship in the British fleet, the HMS Sandwich. It was last seen in Rhode Island, of all places, where it was deliberately sunk so it would clog up a harbor and keep French ships from being able to get in. That's a neat story that I plan to expound on in a different episode, but I'm going to wait because we're still waiting for the details of this discovery to get settled. So back to Captain Cook. Let's start with the good stuff, because like I said, Cook was an impressive man. One of his jobs was tracking the path of Venus, which was incredibly important to England's Royal Society. By taking his ship to the other side of the Earth, Captain Cook could make observations that couldn't be made in England. Whenever he returned to England, he carried important scientific achievement back with him, not just astronomy, but other parts of natural science too. The British saw their world and the entire galaxy grow larger and larger with every one of Cook's voyages. He was so important and so well-liked that during the Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin asked that American ships not shoot at Captain Cook. His work was more important than the war. Captain Cook was an excellent seaman. He could sail across the Pacific with minimum casualties, and he was the only captain at the time who could successfully fend off scurvy on long voyages. He famously discovered Australia's Great Barrier Reef when he crashed right into it. His ship was so damaged it nearly sank, and he had to eventually replace it, but he managed to make repairs, complete his mission, and return all the way to England in that same ship. So, why doesn't anyone like this guy? He sounds great. Well, I'll start with something that happened when he made it to the mainland of Australia, where Cook says something supernatural happened. Before we go there, you need to know that there used to be people in the British Empire who thought they were special. They believed they had created a superior culture with their scientific and legal and cultural advancements. And when you look closely at these people, you see that many of them truly believed that they were somehow better than other people. They were not just richer or more educated, but actually better in some magical, mystical way. And when they cast their gaze upon other cultures, they often felt a bit of pity for those places that lacked education or strong laws. And they truly believed that colonizing those distant lands and teaching them to act like Britons was going to help them. I can't stress this enough, the British often saw themselves as superior people, like they had made themselves into different, elevated, more evolved persons. It's not hard to imagine how destructive this point of view can be. If you think of someone as a lesser person, then you can justify mistreating them. We've all seen that. So it's easy to see why the British would have no trouble treating other people like cattle. And Captain Cook is one of the most striking examples of this behavior, and it seems to have gotten worse with each one of his voyages. On his first voyage, Captain Cook visited a lot of faraway lands that the British knew almost nothing about. But his biggest find, literally, was the continent of Australia. Now it's debated whether or not he was the first European to visit, but he did open the first ongoing dialogue with the indigenous people there. He also planted a flag and claimed the entire place for the British Empire. That's par for the course during the age of exploration, but it's worth pausing to realize how ridiculous this was. You can't go into your neighbor's front yard and just decide that it's actually yours, but that's what Cook did. And nobody in the so-called civilized world seemed to notice just how silly that looked. But before claiming Australia, something else happened that I really can't get over. See, Cook noticed that the locals really didn't care about him as he was approaching land. And that bothered him and his crew. You see, anywhere else they went, Captain Cook's gigantic ship and his modern-looking crew would capture everyone's attention long before they made landfall. But when he approached the shores of Australia, the indigenous people didn't respond like Captain Cook expected. They glanced up at the ship and then ignored it, just going about their business. Maybe this is because they'd seen ships before. Or maybe Captain Cook just wasn't as interesting as he thought he was. But it didn't sit right with Captain Cook and his crew, and they developed a theory more ridiculous than anything I've talked about. They decided that the locals weren't distracted by the ship because, get this, because they couldn't see the ship. The ships were invisible to the indigenous people of Australia. Why? Because it was too advanced. They believed the simple people of Australia were just not able to comprehend anything as advanced as Captain Cook's boat, so they literally couldn't see it. And that's hilarious. If that's not a god complex, I don't know what is. Captain Cook, in his first voyage, has already attributed a supernatural power to his ship and himself, and he's just getting started on this power trip. Throughout his voyages, Cook would find himself taking on an imperious role amongst indigenous people, and this often took the form of violent punishments for locals who committed crimes against him, or people he thought committed crimes against him. Captain James Cook believed he was the law wherever he went, and he believed he could just dish out any punishment he wanted. He once flogged a local man who stole a few things from his ship, flogged him publicly. Now you might think this is almost fair. After all, the man did steal from Cook, and Captain Cook would flog his own men just as easily. He had a horrible temper and he reacted violently when he didn't like what was going on. But he was anything but fair. For one thing, he claimed he was bringing the British version of justice to these people, even though no one had asked for it. But he often went too far. Once he even carved a pair of crucifixes into a man's flesh down to the bone as a punishment. That's not something he learned from the British justice system, that's just vindictive. While Cook eagerly punished thieves, he didn't seem to care about stealing from other people. You see, it was only considered theft if you were stealing from him. For example, in Australia, Captain Cook gathered up an enormous amount of wildlife to feed his crew, which doesn't sound like a problem until you realize that he was stealing the resources of the indigenous people that they needed to survive. Taking that much wildlife not only makes food scarce, it can make food scarce for a long time. Nature is volatile like that. And when the locals saw him gathering up all their food, they knew it would lead to food scarcity. They asked him to compromise, to leave some of it behind, but Cook wasn't interested. He wouldn't budge. And when someone tried to take back one of the turtles, he shot at them. Now, it should be pointed out that the Royal Society had asked Captain Cook to treat indigenous people fairly and to try really hard to avoid killing any of them. Sometimes Captain Cook would try his best to follow these orders, and sometimes he really didn't try at all. He's sort of a complex man. Oh, and speaking of complex, let's go back to that God complex issue and see if the divine shoe fits. Of course, there's no such thing as a God complex in formal psychology, but the closest thing is NPD, Narcissistic Personality Disorder. Now, I'm not a psychologist, and it would be inappropriate for me to try and diagnose anybody with a personality disorder. After all, I like to criticize armchair historians who think history work is easy, but armchair psychologists are probably even more dangerous. Psychoanalysis is a difficult and complicated job, and bad things happen when untrained people, like me, act as if psychology is easy. So while I want to approach psychology with respect, it's easy to say with confidence that the symptoms of a narcissistic personality disorder are very easy to find in Captain Cook. Let's take a look at a few of the criteria as defined by the American Psychiatric Association. The APA says that a person with narcissistic personality disorder may show arrogant or haughty behaviors, have a grandiose sense of self-importance, believe that they are special and can only be understood by other special people. They require excessive admiration. They have a sense of entitlement. They exploit other people and completely lack empathy. Now that sounds exactly like somebody we know, someone who came up with a theory about his ships being invisible because he was disappointed at not getting enough attention. Someone who could justify doing horrifying punishments on people who he had no business punishing. Someone who would kill another person over theft while stealing that person's livelihood. Someone who, later on, just might have been comfortable impersonating a god. On his third voyage, Captain Cook sailed to the Pacific in search of the Northwest Passage, a path through the Arctic that would make it very easy to ship things to Asia. At this point, it's staggering to imagine Cook's career, taking him from Australia to the Arctic and nearly everywhere in between. Captain Cook did a lot of things on his third voyage, but his last stop was Hawaii. He was the first Westerner to set foot there, as far as we know, and he received a very unusual welcome. The locals met him before he could even get off his boat, and they carried him to shore with an extravagant ceremony where they basically treated Captain Cook like he was Elvis Presley. Why? It turned out the time of year he arrived coincided with a certain religious ceremony meant to honor a god named Lono. Not only that, but Captain Cook's ship circled the island in a certain direction before landing in a way that reminded people of the stories of their god, Lono. So when his ship approached the shore, the people of Hawaii took in Captain Cook, believing he was their long-awaited god. Or so we're told. Actually, all of this information comes from Captain Cook and his crew. It's heavily debated whether or not the people of Hawaii believed he was the god Lono. Maybe they just thought he was a priest of Lono. There was a significant language barrier, but he was treated like someone special, someone who might be holy, but will probably never know exactly who or what they thought he was. Either way, you have to admit it takes a strange person to go along with a reception like this. No matter what the Hawaiians were actually thinking, Captain Cook appears to have been perfectly comfortable impersonating a deity. But it didn't take long for the locals to realize that Cook didn't have much in common with Lono. For one thing, Lono was, among other things, a god of peace, and peaceful is not a word anyone has ever used to describe Captain Cook. And after Cook fell into his usual ways of exploitation and violent punishments, the Hawaiian natives couldn't wait for him to leave. Captain Cook's holiness also must have come into question when he tried to trade for the right to cut down a certain set of trees that he was going to use in repairing his ship. Because he didn't know that these trees that he wanted to use were sacred trees. These were holy trees. No one was allowed to use those trees for anything. And when Cook realized they weren't going to let him cut the trees down, he just cut them down anyway. So if anyone on the island had actually mistaken Captain Cook for a god, they were probably getting over it by now. Eventually, Captain Cook raised anchor and left, and according to his own logs, no one was disappointed to see him go. No one was disappointed to leave. Everyone was glad to be parting ways with each other. So it was especially frustrating when the mast snapped a few days later and he had to turn back around. This time, there was no fanfare, no admiration. In fact, relations between the two groups were downright hostile. Apparently, some things were stolen from Captain Cook during this time, and we all know how gracefully he handled that sort of thing. Cook decided to try something that had worked in the past. He would kidnap someone and hold them for ransom until the stolen items were returned. This time, he decided he'd kidnap someone important, the chief. Now, he and the chief were remarkably actually on good terms with each other. So, on Valentine's Day in 1779, Captain Cook approached the local chief and invited him back to the ship. The chief agreed, and the two of them began walking toward the shore. But someone smelled a rat. A few of the chief's advisors realized that Captain Cook was up to something and tried to stop them. It didn't take long for the chief to realize he was in trouble, so he stopped walking and then just sat down on the beach, forcing Cook to try and drag him if he wanted to take him to the ship. A rebellious crowd began pushing in, trying to protect the chief, and that's when Cook realized that his time in Hawaii was up. He ran from the growing mob and tried to order his ship to leave, but he wasn't fast enough. He soon found a dagger right in his back. A dagger that someone had bought from him, believe it or not. Well, that's one version. Another version says that Captain Cook was hit and killed with a wooden club. This was such a popular story that people began seeing this wooden stick on display at museums. You could pay a nickel and see the infamous club that killed Captain Cook. Of course, these were all fakes. Speaking of famous sea captains, have you heard of William Bligh? Well, maybe not, but I bet you've heard of the mutiny on the HMS Bounty. William Bligh was the captain on that ship before the mutiny, and he was also a member of James Cook's crew. When Captain Cook was killed, Bligh was watching through a telescope. And when Cook's body hit the ground, Bligh says that he watched as locals pulled his body apart and carried the pieces away. A few more of the crew were killed before the rest of them made it to the ship. What happened to Cook's body, though, is the strangest part of this story. The crew asked the Hawaiians to return his corpse so they could take it back to England for a proper burial. The Hawaiians refused. Instead, they gathered what they could of his body and had it prepared and cleaned, going through a ceremony that they only used for very important, very revered people in their own culture. He was still being treated like a holy person, even though everyone hated him. This is not an easy thing to explain. A small part of Cook's corpse was given to the crew. The ship's carpenter took some wood from the ship, and he built a tiny little fit-in-the-palm-of-your-hand-sized coffin to hold the remains, including an inscription on the bottom about the god Lono. But the question remains, did the Hawaiians think Cook was actually a god? We'll never know. And I have to wonder about the stories that were told on the island. Cook's arrival must have been an event that changed their worldview forever, that gave them a new understanding of everything. A god arrived on their shores. Or maybe someone from an advanced culture, like a movie about aliens. No matter how he was remembered, it would have changed the way they saw the world and themselves forever. And after we learn about the crimes of Captain Cook, it's not hard to understand why in recent years his statues have become targets for vandalism and destruction. While his contributions are impressive and difficult to measure, he'll sadly always be remembered as an example of some of the worst aspects of colonial thinking. Captain Cook's death must have come as a shock to the British. Their superiority had been completely rejected by the Hawaiians, who saw Cook as nothing but a bully. The people of Hawaii stood up to their bully and sent him home in the world's smallest coffin, even though it meant standing up to and killing one of their own gods on Valentine's Day. Well, thanks for listening. As always, I'm going to ask you to check out authoradamjones.com and sign up for the mailing list so I can tell you about my books and about other things you'll enjoy. Until next time, I'm Adam Jones, and I'll be back with more of history's lost legends.